had one bull, he had a new wife, and for 1 year he was surviving just on bread, salt, and whatever he could grow. He managed to do well enough to survive long enough to eventually have 13 children from ages 22 to 72. You can imagine it wasn't just because of one wife. In fact, that was part of the challenge. He had 3 girls in a row, and he got a second wife because he thought the first one was defective. But my father was born to the first one, and he never quite forgave his father for that, because he grew up in the other hut. His mother died of malaria by the time he was 10. There was treatment at that time, and he saw that his mother did not get the treatment. And so he decided he would become a doctor. I don't know, he'd never seen a doctor. But he left the village, went to Nagpur, went to medical school, ultimately got an opportunity to do surgical training in the United States, had me and my sister, never went back. The reason he didn't go back was because when I got the smallpox vaccine, his plan was to return with my mother to Nagpur. I had a bad reaction to the smallpox vaccine. I got encephalitis as a consequence. It was a rare consequence of the condition of the vaccine, and I was not allowed to leave the United States. So in 1979 was the first time I got to come to India. I was 14 years old, because public health had eradicated smallpox. And the first thing to understand is that public health can do these things. And we've been there through those kinds of experiences, and I got to benefit from that. And then as I grew up now from a teenager onward, I saw my father's village, saw my nieces, nephews, and cousins, dozens of them, and saw what their lives were like. And over time, what I've gotten to see is the effect of India's productivity revolution. Their lives, which have been entirely agricultural lives, have now become, in the next generation, my generation, lives that are predominantly moving back and forth between the city and the village. They've lived in slums, they've worked in call centers, they've ended up in businesses in Pune and other places all around. And we've seen this extraordinary transformation in their economic prospects. Seen them go from a place where malnutrition was one of their biggest problems, to where diabetes is now one of their biggest problems, from a different kind of malnutrition. And the fascinating thing and the difficult thing to understand is what has happened in that productivity revolution, because their experience in the commercial part of India has been a radical change. But the experience on the healthcare side of India is that with their economic prospects, their ability to trust in the healthcare system has only declined over time. The government sector was regarded with great regard. It was the highest quality in the system, to where now that is one where they don't trust being able to go to the government sector as part of the system. And so when I try to think about that, and Marianne asked me a challenging question, what are the metrics that allow you to define how does the system actually begin to change? And it reminded me of a set of work that we've been doing for a while with the Harvard Business School, London School of Economics, Stanford Business School, where they have a set of metrics for measuring how does the systemness in retail and manufacturing change. A woman named Raphael Sidhu we've been partnering with. And what they showed was that in retail and manufacturing, there are 4 basic measures of what a well-functioning system has. Let's say it's a shop, or it's a factory, or it's a service store. And number 1 is that you have a measure around your human resources. Do you hire for talent? And do you reward that talent? And at the highest level, do you reward the people who gather that great talent? Number 2 is, do you set targets for what your organization is going to accomplish? And at the highest level, everyone understands those targets and they are stretch targets. Third, do you have measures around those targets and around what's needed as the building blocks for those targets? And are those measures also transparent to everyone in the organization? And then the 4th one is what they call lean. It's what's your measure of standardization, but the lean concept is hard to describe except to say that it captures the notion that the people who are doing the work are also designing the work. They are standardizing the work together. They are part of. The frontline worker is part of the team when they look at their gaps in their ability to hit their targets. And what they have shown is that they've done these global measures. They've measured tens of thousands of firms across the world. And as those measures happened, India shifted. India was in the 1s and 2s and 3s. And now it's in the 3s and 4s and 5s, and the 1s and 2s go out of business. Because people don't go to the ones who can't do a good job anymore. There's a consequence. And I see my cousins and nieces and nephews learning how to build these places, how to do these things. I have a cousin who runs a call center with hundreds of people, and they know how to do this. And he learned in his 20s. Now, we began working with them to try to apply these measures in the healthcare sector. And they've also applied them to the education sector. And what you see is that in every country, those have lagged the retail and manufacturing sectors. Our ability to do those four things has been missing. But in India, it's particularly striking because it's been a complete divide between what's happened in the commercial part of the world and what's happened in healthcare and education, where it's remained with 1s and 2s and 3s out of a scale of 1 to 5. Because the 1s and 2s never fail. They never fail. And even in the US, we may average a 3 and a 3 plus, but we don't have any 5s. In fact, in the whole world, there is not a single hospital that is a 5, whereas most manufacturing retail are 4s and 5s. But our 1s and 2s never go out of business. Nowhere is that. So that's the second thing I'd say is that, so what happens when you create that sense of we are looking at the level of our talent, we're rewarding the high talent, we are pushing the talent that are not doing their job aside, and we're sustaining that ability and making, transparent measures and trying to work against them. I think really Dr. Malhotra hit on this core point, is that it is a radical culture change. It is a radical culture change to go away from thinking that awareness of the quality of your people, the quality of your services, the targets you're trying to hit, deserves blame, deserves attack, deserves punishment, to flipping and beginning to say, you get blamed when you don't ask these questions, when your gaps aren't transparent. And that's where I'm really struck. And this is why I thought it was such a remarkable panel. I've lived in the United States, went through my training in surgery at a time when we were in the cusp of making this shift from the blame game around safety and quality. My first article, and I'm just connected for me that you were handing out even my first book, which is Complications, I wrote as a surgery resident. And my first article I'd ever written for a public place was for the New Yorker about a patient that I nearly killed because of an error I made. And there were roots in, the ways I wasn't trained, but there were roots in also just, I had not done my job prepared. And we were just making that shift where maybe 5 years before, it would have been enough to get me fired from the hospital. And instead, to where I became a professor in the same hospital. To where people were thinking that this would be a threatening thing to talk about, and instead, all the way up to my hospital president, they were proud that I told the story. And it had become something that allowed me to feel that I could be in a safe place to describe what are our gaps and what's the nature of where we fail. And I've seen the leadership of Foxy, one right after the other, do this and say this. When I wrote Complications and I did my tour in England, I had the presidents of the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland and in England say that this is an American problem, this is not an issue here in the UK. We've never had, a sponge left somewhere, left inside someone after surgery for these kinds of problems that I was talking about in the book. And that culture change, to see it, it has been there as a major barrier throughout our medical system in India and in most of the world. And that ability to drive that culture change and exert your leadership and tell your stories, I think, is crucial. The ability to make it personal, to talk about your own failures, sets a critical example just to start the process. One of the things that we see in our work in the Ariadne labs, whether it's in surgery or childbirth or primary health care or end-of-life care, is that getting to experience going through these kinds of programs like Manyata, where you have a safe place to look at your performance, to have your problems exposed, and to begin to show people that it's not only okay, but you will be better for it. That is the dramatic culture change that's necessary. What we've seen is that once you have gotten practice at it, practice builds practice. That and I was struck by one of the people who stood up to say that this allowed them to get accreditation as a hospital. That is the culture change that gets begun by walking your way through these programs. So the ability of people here from FOGSI to say that they see the aspiration and in fact call out Merck from others for saying, we're going to make it so it will never happen that a mother dies. And they'd say, that one of them said, well, that's the aspiration, but let me tell you the reality. I think Dr. Gawande is the one who said that. And the reality is we're nowhere near that place. That ability to not pretend and speak the truth is crucial. And so I'd say that come to the second part of this, which is that it allows us to start a cycle that there's a great study that was done by a group called the Bridgespan Group in the United States that looked at 15 major social revolutions. And they were very simple revolutions. There were ones like people wearing seatbelts, people in Vietnam going from 15% helmet use on motorcycles to 95% helmet use on motorcycles, or the creation of hospice, or smoking cessation, smoking tobacco control. And what they found when you mapped what happened to create the social change. First was you had to have a shared understanding of the problem. Second, you then had to arrive at clear, feasible, doable milestones. Manyata, you talked about the feasible, doable milestones. Third, you have to design for scale. It has to be simple enough to happen at massive scale. Fourth, you have to drive demand. You can't assume people are going to grab for it. You have to drive the demand. It's a social movement and not just a technical movement. And then finally, you have to measure and course correct. There's a critical role that a catalyst plays, they found in all of those programs. The catalyst does the surveillance, measures the truth of where things are, and convenes people around that truth, and helps drive a cycle. They may not produce the milestones or the tools or things like that, but bring people together in ways that cross government, private, public sector, academics, and so on, to work your way around the cycle. Now, the last thing that I thought was really striking about their work was that the average time from the launch of these efforts to getting the change to occur as a large norm of the world, their average was well over 25 years. And that is not the cycle. We all want to have things happen, but it is the reality of driving change at deep, deep levels. What you're doing here, you can't even start on the cycle if you don't have the willingness to recognize the failures and get away from the blame game. You have accomplished a lot by being able to get this far. I still read in the Indian newspapers, however, that whenever a death occurs, whenever something terrible happens, I remember the Chhattisgarh case where women were in a camp for 87 women in a camp where they did bilateral tubal ligation, and there was a necrotizing infection that went through, was passed from the minimally invasive equipment because they weren't properly sterilized. That was the real story in the end. Was a sepsis passed from one woman to another, so that 50 ended up in critical care and 18 died from a procedure that you should never die from. And a real question why they were even having tubal ligation when we have LARFs. But anyway, what happened? The surgeon went practically to jail. They blamed it on a drug company, and no one was really working on what was the nature of the system problem underneath. And so, as far as FOMC has come, it is still an uphill battle that we have to continually bring to the media, because 20 years later in the United States, we've gone from that exact same thing happening when we had deaths that would make the news, to one where, when an Ebola case spread in Dallas, they didn't arrest the nurse, they didn't arrest the doctor, they blamed the leaders of the hospital and the leaders of the Center for Disease Control. How can you not make our system more effective in catching these problems? And I thought that was a remarkable change and a place to come. The last thing that I'll say is a comment on all of this about, and a reflection, that is why, by the way, I think this was such a remarkable panel. It's a sign of conversations that I've been part of for more than a decade in India, and the shift that has occurred to putting quality on the map. Now, the other part was putting private sector quality on the map. And I think that also reflects a global shift that has been happening. There's a kind of an obscure Australian researcher named John Braithwaite who's done 20 years of writing about something called regulatory capitalism. And what he's gotten at is that conservative and liberal governments all over the world focused on having government do delivery, essentially. Government own the coal mines, own the power plants, own the banks, own the hospitals, and did the delivery for most of the world. And didn't do a great job. And conservative and liberal began shifting at different rates, but all over the world, basically, you've seen a shift to where the role of government now is to finance and make sure that there is equity, but instead to rely more and more on the private sector for complex delivery. Because the ability to build that transparency, to avoid the politics and the blame game, to be able to say, you know what, if you're an underperforming worker, you cannot stay in the job. That there is transparency, we're not going to game it. Required allowing independent audits. Required allowing things that you couldn't play politics with. And so the world started shifting towards having the government play the role of the independent audits and the financing, but the private sector doing the delivery. And so what strikes me here is that you are moving, I've heard from others at FIGO, towards building that audit capacity. What can you measure in Manyata? And then how do those audits support improvements and change rather than simply punishment? At the bottom level, we do have to have ways that you say no, that a place that is not meeting a standard and cannot lift itself, it's not making progress, has to not be able to receive that government funding. But you look in India, and what started with RSBY and now is moving to Modi Care, it's opening a world where we're going to see even more shifting of the delivery of complex delivery to the private sector. And these kinds of efforts, these kinds of tools, we aren't putting nearly enough into it. This is a powerful and important set of work that is underway. With that, I'll just say, seeing my own family, their experiences in care in rural India, the way they float between the rural and the urban, and more seek care in the private sector, I know that as you spread this work, it's going to make a difference. It's my own family. For that, I just say, thank you.